Occasionally on this channel, we cover other MMOs. Today is one of those days. Elder Scrolls Online was released back in 2014 and has since had half a dozen major expansions and a ton of chapter updates, as well as DLCs to add to this sprawling online rendition of Tamriel. And if you think at any point, maybe this is for me, there will be a link below where you can check out Elder Scrolls Online for yourself. And yes, this video is sponsored by Bethesda. However, they more or less approached me and said, hey, we want you to check out some of the early game and say what you think about it, whatever that may be, which I certainly appreciate, because Elder Scrolls Online for the longest time should have been an MMO, which I have tried a lot sooner. I've been an Elder Scrolls fan since I played Oblivion a few years after it launched, and I remember being at university on 11/11/11 when Skyrim dropped and getting launched into orbit by the first giant I came across. So a multiplayer version of a universe I already know I like sounds pretty interesting to me. Embracing the full-on new player approach, I did the online class quiz to see what the game reckoned would fit me the best, but to be honest, I know myself, and with online games I usually pick some variant of a spellcaster. I like to see what different types of magic they use, are there multiple different builds I can check out, how they interact with allies, enemies, and so on. Also, it's magic and Elder Scrolls, so I also had some kind of inkling of what I was going to be getting. Of course, I ended up on Sorcerer, and the game recommended a few quests that will be worth looking into as well, more on that later. I also noticed your role wasn't defined by swapping to a different specialization, but by changing weapons. A destruction staff and light armor would make me a DPS, a restoration staff and light armor would be more of a healer or utility class, whilst heavy armor and a one-hander and a shield would make me into a pet tanking class. There was a very nice introductory cinematic that showed off a bunch of the world's various biomes as well as a number of allies and enemies as well. Then we got straight onto making a character after that. And I think at some point in these single player games, I've played as basically every option given, from the Orc Warrior to the Stealth Archer Khajiit. And from memory, casters in this universe are usually pretty good as Breton or High Elves, and that also seemed to be the case here. So I made a high as possible elf and messed around with all the various sliders for a while, which included all of the options, and was solid from an overall customization point of view, especially for the face, before realizing, hey, there's a pair of bars on the window behind me and a dodgy looking sleeping bag on the floor. Oh wait, I'm playing an Elder Scrolls game, of course we start in prison, it's practically tradition, right? Anyways, after a spot of jailbreaking, it was onto something which I tend to dread with new games. Do they have a somewhat familiar control scheme, or am I relearning everything from square one? Fortunately, that nice thing happened where you press a button and it does what you hoped that it would have done. Honestly, I found moving about, interacting with the UI, equipment, and combat to be very intuitive. The one issue I found was on the default game, it wouldn't allow certain combination keybinds of shift plus various numbers, which I would usually be using. After finding a staff, it was onto the combat basics. Being such a huge part of an MMO, I was eager to see how combat had moved from the single player games over to this format. And in many regards, there was a lot of familiarity here. This will be an ongoing trend between ESO and the single player games, though with more than just a couple of bits added on. There was either a third or first person view, as well as light or heavy attacks with your main weapon. When your character was stunned, there was counterplay in the form of reacting fast and breaking out of them using certain inputs. On top of this, my character's ability to interrupt enemy casts was not linked to an ability, but instead was more of a weapon bash, with a follow-up heavy attack knocking the enemy down. Oh, and there's also dodge rolling. A limited ability bar would become more of a feature as I leveled up, but as for the basics, this got me started. As for upgrading my character, there were a number of different actives and passives to unlock through your 3 class trees, your active weapon, your armor type, your racial bonuses, as well as world extras. It sounds as though it's a lot, but at the start each tree only had a couple of things that you could look at, so much like the controls, it was pretty intuitive to pick up. Also, you know, it's Elder Scrolls, so I was kind of familiar with it in a sense as well. After 2 more introductory boss fights, the tutorial was all done, and it was time to choose which side of Tamriel I wanted to start off on. This portal room would allow you to go practically anywhere and seemed like a nice addition for people who wanted to play multiple alts. Being able to choose from tons of different starting zones and fit your character's theme is something I can see myself doing. Being a sorcerer though, the choice that made the most sense for me was the location of their latest full expansion, High Isle. So off I set into this zone and to explore the main quest. And initially I thought this might just be the tutorial, is that everything was voice voice acted. The main quest, the class quest, the random side quests, the lot of it. A lot of games tend to cut corners here and only go to this trouble on the big quest lines, so to see it persistent throughout all the content I experienced was something I appreciated. ESO clearly wants to be a sound-on MMO, well, at least through the first storyline playthrough of each zone. As I continued on, I was often again reminded of how the single-player games were. The questing format hit that same kind of formula, which just works. You go out somewhere and on the way there's several side activities, all of them trying to catch your eye, to the point where you could end up doing something which is completely different than what you set out to do originally, but then it's all worthwhile in terms of experience gained and gear upgrades. There were also dynamic weather effects present in the game, as well as day and night cycles. These two things for me really add to the immersion that an MMO can have, so I was glad to see both were being used. Graphically, the game holds up well, I would say, with good levels of character detail, and the open world environments also fitted well and had fairly good render distances too. During my leveling, there were also a few times questing where running into an enemy camp and pulling too much was clearly not going to be the play. Enemies having the ability to lock you down as well as repositioning themselves via stealth or dashing actually made the health bar get fairly low at times. In many early games you can just kind of run through everything and it's not going to be a problem, and in ESO if you take things slower it was a lot more simple and sensible at that, but it's good to see the game mechanics mattering at the start, not just being an afterthought until you hit endgame, though I will admit this probably had quite a lot to do with me being completely new as well. I may have totally intentionally also tested out death mechanics a bit later on when trying to solo an open world mini-boss, which, you know, turned out not to be the best of ideas. But eventually I found the quest that the quiz had recommended at the start called Wisdom of the Druids, which had me going around several volcanic outbursts and investigating any potential unnatural activities. And during this quest I came across one of ESO's open world activities, where loads of lava creatures were spawning from a volcanic vent. Several other players also popped up at this point in time too, and it was a nice mix-up from your standard questing and leveling, and gave a proper chance to see how my character's toolkit worked in combat, which lasted for more than about 30 seconds to a minute, and as it turns out it went pretty fast and was missing a bunch of passive mana bonuses you get through skill points from leveling up later on. Nevertheless, it was a good look into how ESO may play way later on once you have many more levels and more experience in the game. Other players also appeared to help with the event too, so I guess these are solid for leveling, and they definitely gave some worthwhile rewards too. I like that the game gave dynamic reasons for people to come together, though there wasn't necessarily any reasons to group up beyond that which I could find, or for any of the content which I had experienced so far for that matter. I did see a number of other people leveling outside of major towns or cities, but it often felt like a reminder that this is an MMO when you encountered somebody else. Finishing up the event, I went and got my nice fire staff upgrade and continued on a little more the main quest line. On my way through there were tons of side events, locations, gathering nodes and so on. There was definitely a lot to keep you busy during the start of the game, that is for sure. There were also hidden achievements such as jumping off the plank at a location called the Albatross Leap. I then realised I was able to queue up for a dungeon, and after about 5 minutes or so joined as a DPS, and it was over pretty fast, that's for sure. It was a really quick blast through, and we also ended up skipping some of the content as well. It gave a ton of XP though, so it seems as though it's a good way to level, or at least to get one dungeon done daily. In fact, in this dungeon I was barely keeping pace with what the others were doing, but those are leveling dungeons for you, I suppose. At this point I decided to try and wrap it up and get down some of my early impressions. On the positive, if you like the universe of the Elder Scrolls, this is a familiar addition to the franchise with relatable questing, environments, stories and characters. The base game comes with a ton of content for a one-time purchase, and it will also be discounted occasionally on Steam as well, so it could be a good investment and a chance to check out a bit more Elder Scrolls whilst waiting for however long Elder Scrolls 6 takes to actually be a thing. Elder Scrolls Online supports multiple platforms including PC, Xbox and PlayStation. There's dynamic open world events, weather and day and night cycles to add to the immersion. There's a lot of side activities going on at any one point. Again, somewhat similar to the single player versions of the game, you get sent on one quest and end up with 5 others before you are done. Every quest which I came across was voice acted, and there was also a solid soundtrack. On the more negative side, for me it felt like an Elder Scrolls game first and an MMO second. It's a very friendly single player experience, perhaps too much so for some people. Saying that, with how MMOs are these days, I know a lot of people enjoy the option to group with others, whilst having the bulk of the content in the game work and be functional as a solo player. So this one could go either way for you. It appears as though you needed add-ons for certain combination keybinds, a small thing, but I just thought I'd mention it. And whilst the game works on multiple platforms, it currently doesn't support cross-platform play. And as a general point, early impressions of games are, well, just that. It's hard to get a really good impression of an MMO where people will watch or comment having played the same game for hundreds or thousands of hours, who will say eventually the game is like this, or you missed that, or you should have talked about this. Generally speaking though, if somebody has that many hours in the game, it's doing something right, so take it all with a grain of salt. On the other or more grey areas, there is also an optional subscription for the game on top of the one-time purchase, and sometimes in my experience these can be less than optional for when you really get into the game, and I'm talking you played for many hours before this will start to be noticeable. Then again, it does unlock a metric ton of extra content and a lot of quality of life features which I can already see coming into play, such as extra bank space. I still think the game offers a lot for a one-time purchase, however. There is level scaling, and level scaling can go either way for people. On one hand, it keeps old zones having some relevance and gives more reason to play with others on different levels of progression. On the other hand, it makes it feel like there is less character progression going from the early zones to late zones, but in my experience, player power gains through existing set bonuses, skill points, as well as just familiarity with combat outpace level scaling quite hard. So overall, do you like the Elder Scrolls universe and want more of it without rebuying Skyrim for the 10th time, waiting for Elder Scrolls 6, or trying to install 100 mods to make the single player games a little bit different? Then you should consider giving Elder Scrolls Online a try. I do have a link below where you can check out the game for yourself if you think it sounds interesting. And you and me both know how it is when you do sponsored content on YouTube, but Bethesda were very happy for me to give a balanced view on the game, so I appreciate that they did that, and I hope I did it justice, and that either way you found the video interesting. That's all from me today though. As always, thanks so much for watching and listening in, and I'll see you all in the next one very soon.